Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And in 2020, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And this week, today, an early episode. We've got two episodes coming up this week. We're taping this one on a Sunday, and it's with Elliot Stein, who is with the Britton consultancy firm, and Elliott is a former Labor guy that's worked in a number of jobs across state and federal ministries for Labor governments, and he's coming on the show today to give us a very, very comprehensive Queensland election preview, because it is now election week. Election day is this coming Saturday, the 31st of October. And Elliott's going to come on and just give us the rundown on what to watch for in terms of the campaign and hopefully the return of a Palaszczuk Labor government on election night. Also, remember that later this week, it's our final preview of the 2020 US presidential election campaign. We've got two guests coming on simultaneously. Sam Schneidman, who you all know and love, former Obama regional field director in the 2008-2012 campaign. And Sam's been with me since, I think October last year. So Sam's coming on, and so is Katie Connolly. And Katie was on maybe a month ago. Former Mayor Pete Buttigieg campaign advisor and a Democratic campaign consultant. So the two of them are going to come on, and we're going to break down everything in terms of the election campaign, because election day is a week on Tuesday, the first Tuesday in November, but obviously it'll be a Wednesday here in Australia. So look out for that. But today's episode is focusing on the first election, which is the Queensland poll on Saturday, the 31st of October. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher and Amazon. And if you're an Apple Podcast user, please leave us a rating and give us a review. And don't forget to follow us on all of the socials at Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn for all of the updates of upcoming and even past podcasts. We've actually been putting out a number of podcasts over the last couple of weeks as we get closer and closer to some crucial elections. So let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Sunday afternoon in lockdown Melbourne, still lockdown Melbourne, and we're heading into the final week of the Queensland state election campaign. Election day is this coming Saturday, the 31st of October. Last week we had the member for South Brisbane Labor's Jackie Trad on the show to talk a bit about the campaign, but in order to get you ready for election night and to be completely up to date, so you can go on Twitter and show all your Twitter friends that you know exactly what you're talking about. We're joined on the line from Northern Queensland, I think, Britton's Elliot Stein. Elliot, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me on.
And happy birthday.
Thank you. That's very, very kind. Thank you.
You're very committed to the cause, and also quite risky, really, to schedule a podcast late afternoon on your birthday. If it had been me, I would be, I'd be well on my way. Put it that way.
Daylight savings being an hour behind where you are is probably helping me out on that front at the moment.
Very good. I'd still do the podcast, but I'd just be cut. That would be, I'd be very frank and very fearless in my commentary. But I expect no different from you, even though you are sober. So let's get into today's episode. The election's this Saturday. Lots to talk about. And I figured what we could do is we could just give a bit of an overview, talk a bit about the policies and the campaign strategies, a bit about some of the other parties, talk a bit about the polling, and then maybe wrap it up with some seats to watch for the folks out there But for those who really haven't been following what's going on in the Queensland election campaign, how about, and certainly for a lot of our listeners that are overseas, in terms of seats held and seats needed to win, what's the state of play going into this election campaign for all the major parties?
Yeah, so this election is a really big, chunky, issues-rich campaign. Labor has been in government now in Queensland for 2 terms. We're seeking a 3rd term in office. That first term, 2015, that wipeout of Newman, where Labor came into power in a minority government setting, 2017. Won and gained a majority of 2, and that's the circumstance we find ourselves now going into the 2020 election. A few quick things to note about why this one's a whole bunch of firsts. The first thing is it's the first really COVID, post-COVID, during COVID election of a state. Obviously, we've had 2 territory elections, but it's the first state election in Australia. In the COVID world. It's also the first time we've had a fixed election date in Queensland, and it's also the first time we're going to be electing a government for 4 years. It's the first 4-year fixed term, bring us into line with all the other state jurisdictions. So a lot on the table, and it's a lot of big prizes there. So Labor coming into the election currently has a majority of only two seats. And then across the board, we've got a crossbench comprised of 1 Green, 3 Katter, 1 One Nation, 1 Indie, and a North Queensland First, which is actually a booted out LNP member turned North Queensland First. And the LNP have the balance there. In order for the LNP to come in and form majority, they've got to find a net gain of 9 seats to get over the line.
Which sounds like a lot, but Queensland politics can be reasonably topsy-turvy. So there is a margin of, error here. Not margin of error. There's tight margins here for Labor in order to make sure that they retain government.
Yeah, that's right. Like with a slim majority of 2, and both those seats are held on 0 point something. Like there are very, very tight margins. Very easy for us to lose government. Equally, very difficult for the LNP to gain a majority government. So you sort of have those 2 tensions at play.
You said the word big before in your opening remarks. Queensland is a big place, and something that I think we Southerners take for granted a lot is the diversity of the state. Just give us a bit of an outline of sort of the regions and how that comes into play when you're considering embarking on a state campaign in the Sunshine State.
Yeah, thanks. It is a really good point, and it's not something that gets appreciated federally. Partly that's due to the boundaries of the federal seats as compared to the state seats and a few other historical reasons, and also I think how people think about federal issues versus state issues and where they sort of see areas of responsibility. So it is easy to lump it as one big block. Here's some unique factors about Queensland. It's the only state in the Commonwealth where there are more people living outside of the metro area than there are in it. So if you think about, Victoria, obviously Melbourne, New South Wales being Sydney, Perth obviously the biggest population centre in WA. In Queensland, more people live outside of that greater Brisbane area than do in it. Now that presents a whole bunch of opportunities, and historically, if you work your way up the coast through all those big regional cities, Labor has done very, very well in those, which again might not be readily apparent to those who aren't as familiar with Queensland state politics. And it's very easy to lump them sort of together, even in that characterisation. But if you think about it, it's sort of southeast Queensland. You've then got the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, 2 unique places, and then you normally just hear about the regions. Well, the regions covers about 8 different ecosystems, all of which have their own media environment. They all have their own community issues. They all have their own industries, and they've normally got 2 to 3 seats clumped together all the way up the coast. So from Wide Bay, Gladstone, Rocky, Mackay, Townsville, Cairns, and then everything west of the Divide and Mount Isa as well, big places, big distances between them, and the issues and what you're talking about in each of those places are not the same as the others. So when you're looking at it and thinking about reading a Queensland election, it's not just southeast versus the regions. There are so many different issues within those.
I learnt that lesson within the first 20 minutes of campaigning in Cairns in 2012. I was sent up there for, I think, a month and a half, and I referred to it as Northern Queensland, and quite quickly they'd point out to me that this is far North Queensland, and I was like, okay, good.
Yep.
I'll just shut up from now on and just listen for the next week and a half before I even kind of consider making any kind of suggestions or opinions about how to campaign.
Very wise. Very wise.
But we won't talk about the results, but that was 2012, so can't blame me. Let's talk about the campaigns itself and the two major campaigns, starting with Queensland Labor and the Palaszczuk government. What has been Labor's sort of positive campaign frame centred around? What is their key message to the electorate, why they want to be re-elected?
Well, it's pretty obvious. As I said, this is the first big major state election in the COVID world, and whether we like it or lump it, this election is really centred on what the government's response to COVID has been, and what the pathway out of the economic impacts of that is going to be. So Labor's campaign is pretty clear of saying, our campaign messaging and framework is all, we're on the road to recovery. We've gone through a lot. We've gone through a lot together. We've had a fantastic health response to something which has crippled other parts of the world, which is obviously, you're the last person who needs to be told about how it's going in other parts of the country. But we have got through that. We have kept that invisible enemy largely at bay. And as a consequence, we're now on that road to recovery. So that's the real positive framework that the government is working with going into this election.
And then trying to fit up your opponents, the LNP, what's the negative frame that you guys, that Labor has campaigned on?
Yeah, so there's probably two aspects to the negative message. The first is, and not dissimilar, I think, to what we saw in the Northern Territory, what you've seen a few times in Victoria, is fitting them up for some pretty reckless anti-science, anti-health views they had about getting out in front of health advice, second-guessing health advice. And where that's really has been centred on is the LNP for 64 times calling for the border to be opened, including, signing a pledge that says, if the LNP were in government, they would have opened the border on the 1st of July, which is right around the time when there were, second wave outbreaks occurring down south. So that's one part of it, is really highlighting, had the LNP been in charge during this health crisis, they wouldn't have been able to manage it. The second part is both a reminder and a forecast about cuts to jobs and services. So everyone remembers Campbell Newman, 14,000 job losses, cutting all sorts of really vital public services, particularly in this example, cutting the public health unit within Queensland Health, which is sort of the team that the Chief Health Officer is using to drive the COVID response and drive it quite successfully. That was, demolished under Newman. So part of it is a reminder about don't forget what the LNP did in office. And the second part is, exploiting a self-goal weakness on the part of the LNP of their refusal to outline how they're paying for a number of big ticket items, is pointing out that given the amount of both revenue and borrowing and other sort of budgetary decisions that they've taken to rule things out, the only option left on the table to fund all sorts of big ticket items that they've got on the table is through another round of cuts to jobs and the public sector entirely. So really what you've seen Labor focusing on there is the risk of LNP cuts, and underlying that is the danger they would have had they been around when COVID first came to our door.
If we cast our mind back to the last major crisis that I think that confronted the Australian economy, and therefore state economies as well, would have been the global financial crisis. And certainly amongst progressive and Labor-minded people, we look back on that period and the work that the Rudd government did in its economic response to staving off a recession, and the only country in the OECD or the industrialized world that did that. But it didn't result in people in voterland saying, wow, thank you, Labor, we really dodged a bullet there. Are we a little worried that leading into the Queensland election that, and I'm only speaking here anecdotally from Victorian family members that do live in Queensland, that have said to me that I don't think that the Queensland population have fully grasped or appreciated the threat that COVID is, because it still does exist, indeed was going to present to the wider population, and the fact that the government has done such a great job in handling it and containing it, this will just be taken for granted. Are we worried about that? Is there a complacency in the community around this?
Yeah, I think in different parts of the community that is, and I'd use the same metaphor. The bullet dodged as the bullet not fell, and I think definitely in some places, particularly probably outside of where we've had a few outbreaks and a number of cases over the course of the year, particularly outside of those communities. Obviously, the further up the coast you get, big tourism dependent places like Cairns and up north. You will get a sense of I wouldn't say complacency, but you definitely would get a sense of nothing going on here. There's no COVID here. What's the problem? As opposed to that more reticent sense of the threat is still there. And I sort of liken it to trying to explain to somebody that if you're in a rainstorm with an umbrella and you're not currently wet, it's not an excuse to put down the umbrella. Like the risk from COVID is still there, even if we're not currently feeling it. And so having that nuanced conversation is really difficult. The difference, I think, with the GFC is there are some really immediate local counterfactuals to demonstrate what happens if things get out of control and cases increase. Very obviously, Victoria, we're seeing some localised issues in New South Wales from time to time as well. Those local counterfactuals are really, I think that keeps that risk present in people's minds. But I think as a consequence of some more domestic things occurring, which as serious and hard as they are, pale in comparison to the international, what we sort of saw here is once the Victorian situation in particular exploded, all the international news coverage about particularly the US and Europe and other places which have been, going through second, third waves, that's really dropped off the conversation and dropped off the media cycle in particular because there's been so much domestic news to cover. So keeping that at the forefront of reminding people of just how vital it is to keep up all of the health defences whilst we're sort of rebuilding economically within the bounds of a federal government decreed international border closure as well for all the right reasons is tough.
Sticking with the LNP, have they been able to present a cogent argument to the Queensland public about why they are ready to govern? How would you give an assessment of their campaign?
It's been an odd LNP campaign to watch. I was thinking about this getting ready for chatting to you. The sort of things you would normally expect to see in an LNP or a sort of a traditional Liberal campaign, and we saw this in the ACT and other places, of sort of lean into that framework of better economic managers, lean into a lower taxes argument, and to sort of make some vague promises about just being better. That kind of hasn't materialised. Instead, we've seen, like their slogan and their campaign slogan does that, of saying, let's get Queensland working again. That sort of sets them up to have that conversation. But the choices and things that they've done along the way, and we can talk about why in a minute, but have either been not even industry specific, they've been like company specific. So, announcing specific policies designed to aid the one company they're standing in when they're doing the announcement. And that happened in both, in Southeast Queensland and in Cairns and other places, which is very odd. There hasn't been any grand narrative or even a grand sweeping statement. So it's not even a small target strategy where you sort of would set out, here's the 3 motherhood statements you come to associate with our party, and here's what we're going to do. They're not even doing that. It's been this series of very strange individual sort of announcements, and then coming into the back half of the campaign is the first time they started to come out with some a youth crime policy in Townsville, and a broad childcare strategy or policy sort of statewide. But that's been the abnormal. What they spent most of their campaign doing has been really defending against perceived threats from the Katter Party and One Nation, particularly out west and in between those regional towns. So you've seen them committing to a massive project, a tens of billions of dollar worth project of 4-laning the Bruce Highway, and that would really be 4-laning sections which mainly go through those seats where they're at risk at being knocked off by another right party. And you've also seen them doubling down and committing to, in their biggest ticket item, committing to what's called the Bradfield scheme, which is about 100-year-old, I was about to say pipe dream, because it uses pipes to sort of turn the rivers inland, put a lot of dams in place. And what you do see, we see the word Bradfield used a lot, is it's on a lot of Paul Hanson material about let's build Bradfield. It's sort of a catch-all sort of slogan for some of those Western seats. And so you've seen the LNP investing a lot of time being quite defensive on those areas as well. So as a consequence, there's not been a very coherent traditional Liberal or even a coherent traditional Liberal national sort of message. It's been very, very localised.
If you're the campaign manager for the LNP, what would you be doing with Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister? Like how much of an asset is he to the campaign? How much has he done in this campaign? I do remember reading that the Premier wasn't letting him in there for a while, which I thought was one of the greatest trolls of all time. Yeah, sure, you can come, but you've got to quarantine for 2 weeks. Where has Morrison been on this campaign?
I should add 2 points. One, it wasn't a Morrison specific policy on that decision. It was anyone coming from Sydney would have had to have quarantined for 2 weeks, or from Canberra at that stage for 2 weeks as well. As much as we might want to have a ScoMo barrier, and it would also be remiss of me to say, if I was the LNP campaign manager, based on public reporting, I don't have the best relationship with the LNP leader. And the president of my party spent a lot of time on both the payroll of Clive Palmer and also then trying to knock over the leader about 3 months before a campaign. So I'm probably under a bit of pressure from the campaign manager of the LNPs. Nice. Be remiss of me to add that for the listeners. In terms of Morrison, I was really surprised. Morrison, obviously coming off the back of the 2019 federal election, had a very good result in Queensland, particularly in a whole bunch of areas where the LNP will be looking to make gains against us. He got into town on a Saturday. He did a bunch of stuff down the Gold Coast with the leader of the opposition, Deb Freckleton. The next day, he went out to a tank manufacturer, Rheinmetall, and on the Sunday news. Some people liken to Michael Dukakis. I don't know who that's unkind to, but he had, I think, objectively had some very good visual images. Won the TV news that night without any question. There, in the tank, waving, and he really looked like he sort of had a head full of steam of being able to spend a week in Queensland. Now, unprecedented for a sitting prime minister to, particularly in a national crisis, to take time out to campaign in a state election, regardless of colour or persuasion. But I sort of could see a scenario where he spent that second week of the campaign, that week right before pre-poll opened, of just barnstorming, as he said, elbow to elbow with the state leader. Instead, over the course of that week, and I don't know the reasons for this, but over the course of that week, it just felt like the wheels sort of came off in that joint campaigning approach. So it was really, really squandered. They ended up doing a very small number of joint appearances. At times he went into areas which were important for them, but it was without the state leader. I think the main thing that they did together was hold a closed-door fundraiser in Brisbane at the same day that the state leader was batting off allegations of impropriety around donors and taking property developer donations and the like. Messy week for them, and so I think what could have been a really big opportunity for them to, capitalise off the popularity of the Prime Minister was really sort of left by the wayside, and I was sort of left quite confused by that.
Just linking that conversation that we just had there about policy announcements and the where they're spending their money, and then moving that into the campaign strategy kind of conversation. And to begin with, are we seeing, and picking up on the point before you said that the LNP were investing a lot of their policy announcements that seem to be on a defensive setting to, sandbag against them losing seats to other far-right campaigns and candidates. Is Labor in an offensive kind of setting? Because I've read some stuff where reading into where the leader's going, where surrogates are going, where campaign ad buys are, where they're spending money in terms of policy announcements, it seems reasonably offensive. Just want to get your take on what Labor's doing and what the LNP are doing in terms of where they're trying to, carve out a path to victory.
Yeah. So on the Labor side, it's been a mixture of offense and defense, as you'd expect. When you've got a margin of 2, you obviously want to keep everything you've got, or keep as much as you've got, and then make some gains to offset any pain that might come off in individuals. Which, given some of the margins that we're dealing with at the lower end of the Labor pendulum, and there's quite a number which are all sort of at 1 or below percent. You've got to do a lot of defensive to make sure that you're in good standing there, but then being realistic, push into LNP territory to make some gains as well. So you're seeing a mixture of that, and I'd say probably leaning more towards offense and defense from the Labor side. On the LNP side, you've got a more interesting scenario of they're both obviously, so they're trying to find and I keep saying the word net because I think it's quite important to remember, they're trying to find a net gain of 9 seats at the same time that there are some seats that they are defending from the far right, and there are seats that they're defending from us, and those two don't overlap by and large. There's 1 or 2 that might end up being some really interesting 2, 3, 4, 5 corner races, particularly some parts of regional Queensland. But by and large, that they are playing a double defensive game, and also trying to work out which of those seats on the fringes of the Labor pendulum they can sort of pick up. Objectively, looking at those 2 scenarios, it is really, really hard for the LNP to find a net gain of 9 seats, which is why I think their only pathway to the Treasury benches is finding a net gain of somewhere around 4 or 5, and then hunting around for a minor party like a Katter or a One Nation to form a minority government with. That, from my eye, is the only realistic pathway they have to forming a government. Whereas Labor has a number of pathways to both retaining and potentially increasing its majority.
What's been your impression of the 2 campaigns from a comm strategy standpoint, starting with traditional media? who is managing to get better pictures, win the TVs at night, that kind of stuff in terms of their announcements?
Definitely the start of the campaign, and Labor came out the blocks really, really smoothly. Better pictures, better events, announcement to match the pictures each night. Just a really good, smooth campaign. The advertising was all there. It all linked up and joined up. To some extent, it's the sort of stuff you expect to see from an incumbent, but particularly expect to see from an incumbent where you've known the whole world has known the election date since the announcement of the 2017 election, because that's the point where it was triggered to put this election date in place. So you saw, a couple of big bang announcements from Labor, particularly in rail manufacturing, in schools, TAFE, skills, a lot of high vis, all the sort of the building blocks of recovery sort of stuff. And it was consistent. The Premier travelled has been travelling most of the campaign with the Treasurer, Cameron Dick. It's been a really good duo between the two of them of how they've handled the daily questions. And you've had the Deputy Premier and Health Minister separately most days doing the daily COVID health update. And then once the health update is done and others have left the stage, doing that attack dog sort of role from wherever he is on that particular day. He's been really quite effective at doing that and sort of throwing spanners in the works for the LNP. Cut to the LNP campaign, and they've spent the first 2 weeks, as I said, and part of this I think was driven by some of the policy decisions they were making. They just spent the first 2 weeks of the campaign looking a bit lost and a little bit surprised that the election was on. Again, baffling given the length of time. Not as baffling when you, and I alluded to it before, when you understand some of the internal dynamics going on. They very publicly had a stoush with the party president, which ended up calling for Peter Dutton ended up calling on him to resign, which he did. They then had a ballot for the new party president. So they've had a lot of churn on the administrative organisational campaign side, which I can't begin to imagine what that's like to go through when you're coming up to a fixed date, 3 months to go before an election. So as a consequence, it just sort of felt like the leader's office or the leader rather, and the campaign weren't as joined up. And that sort of personified itself. And then the policy choices they're making about sort of just going to, by look of it, individuals they knew and giving them the thing that they wanted, as opposed to going, here's our policy on this, here is our industry-wide policy on this, here's our recovery plan on this. So that first couple of weeks was very messy. And as a consequence, they were very much exposed to any incoming flack that they got, and they got a lot. So they had, like I said, they had some donation issues where it came to light that their own party had referred them to the Electoral Commission because the party office was concerned about events the leader's office had been holding. A bunch of questions about how they're going to pay for their commitments. So they ended up getting into a whole conversation about forced redundancies versus voluntary redundancies, which is all of which in a frame you don't want to be talking about if you're them. And the number one, I think, strategic error and campaign error they made was the day before the campaign formally kicked off. The LNP leader got up and it's on the Queen's birthday long weekend, and she committed that the LNP will be putting Labor last on every single how to vote card in every single seat. Now, that's not too new in Queensland. In the 2017 election, the LNP sort of did a bit of a half-pregnant kind of version where they did that in some seats but not others. This is the first time they've ever done a blanket put Labor last on every how to vote card, and I'm sure your listeners will pick up of what that means when you've got contests that involve One Nation, contests that involve Palmer, contests that involve anti-vaxxers, They made this decision before all the nominations were closed. They made this decision not knowing all of the parties and who were running in all the different seats. And it also meant that they were going to be putting in places like South Brisbane, for example, putting the Greens above Labor on their how to vote card. So what it meant is it left them susceptible, quite legitimately susceptible to the argument that LNP preferences in the south of the southeast were going to be electing Greens members, and LNP preferences in the north were going to be electing One Nation. So it was a very odd choice. And I really enjoyed listening to the podcast you did with the former Deputy Premier earlier last week about the absolute fight they've got on their hands in South Brisbane. And, when the LNP had decided to break every convention, including conventions that have been established since Howard, it shows you how effective Jackie is in South Brisbane, that they are doing absolutely everything they can to blast her out, even if it means doing this blanket statewide preference deal to support Greens, Qatar, One Nation. So that was a very odd start to the campaign. So as a consequence, a long way of answering your very short question is a very messy campaign optically. They have, in fairness to them, and it was actually a little bit surprising, more recently in the last week, they sort of had 2 days of okay pitches, and that was a sort of more jarring to see them in the race at all.
Just you going through that very detailed analysis of the mainstream campaign comms, it feels very similar to 2018 here in Victoria. The campaign from Labor's perspective started very, very strongly, and I feel they set that tone and held it up for the large majority of the campaign all the way up until election day. And there were a couple of days where the Conservatives kind of got their shit together and had reasonably good days, but otherwise we were waiting. We're kind of waiting for this, where they would start to be competitive and draw the attention of the journalists and the TV cameras and their announcements, where you'd sort of go, oh, that was a good announcement, that one, they got us on that. And it just never materialised. So it's interesting you're saying this about Queensland as well. I hope that then means that you're going to get an absolute landslide victory on Saturday. But
we'll happily take your 18 result. But no, it feels very, very similar, and like great example. So the Sunday before Prepoll opened, both of the major parties had their campaign launches. Where did the LNP go? To a ballroom in Brisbane, and their only announcement was a new flyover video of a dam in North Queensland. Where did Labor go? It was a plumbing trades training centre in Logan with a bunch of high-vis wearing workers and apprentices, and outlined a series of jobs and training announcements. And I think that tells you everything.
Yeah, love it. That's great. We are in COVID. And it's, as you said at the top of the podcast, it is a COVID election. I'm just interested to get a sense about how Labor's ground campaign is faring in under these conditions and forcing the campaigns to adjust to these restrictions. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, and look, this is well and truly your wheelhouse and not mine. So I won't pretend to be any more expert than I am on this, but. The main part for most of the year is that because of different COVID restrictions, some of them self-imposed, some of them by health restrictions, some of them by sort of the party being ultra cautious. There's been a bit of a restriction for most of the year on the ability to door knock. That hasn't been a tool as valuable as much. But now is where we're sitting at the campaign, even with those restrictions, and some of those have now, they've been coming off. The field team has managed to do 500,000 door knocks and phone call conversations over the course of the campaign, which I think is, in a state of 3.3 million electors, is a pretty sizable whack.
That's huge. That's great. Have we got any sense that the LNP have got folks on the ground knocking on doors or making calls?
They will be in some areas. But primarily where they've sort of got existing strong branches, and particularly active federal MPs as well, I think drive a lot of that. You see a bit of it in inner city. Brisbane is probably where they centre a lot of it, whereas we've got a more decentralised approach.
And the other thing, just on the campaign structure infrastructure, is the shiny thing that journalists love to write tons and tons of columns about, and that's social media campaigning. Obviously, this is a COVID election, so therefore it's driving the campaign online. Any innovation that you can note that's coming out of the campaign that surprised you? And that's clearly come about because the fact that we've had to deal with these restrictions.
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of both. So COVID's the great accelerator and the great disruptor on all things, and I think for the media cycle and social media in particular, it's driven what was already trending that way to go a lot faster. So I think the tool of the Facebook live stream has, in a lot of ways, is jumping and is en route to getting in front of traditional media sources as a source of information. And you talk to people who run media companies in Queensland, and they know it, and they know that a premier's not dissimilar to Victoria and in other jurisdictions, but a premier's press conference will get more eyeballs or a rival amount of eyeballs than the evening news, and a whole lot more so than readers of the Courier Mail. So as a consequence, you're seeing Facebook live streams of press conference becoming, for the first time, I think, since like the Kennedy era, becoming a direct form of communication to people. And you've seen that from on the Labor side in particular. I think if used well, and if you know what you're doing, this really favours executives, executive government, of where you've been able to build an audience over COVID, because people turn to you as a source of information, and the daily press conference and the daily health briefing was a vital piece of life or death information each day. Built big social media audiences, and as a consequence, now have a means of directly communicating to people without necessarily the filter of traditional media. So the post reach and the audience that the Premier's social media account will now gain is wildly significant, and you're seeing that factor into media announcements, communications announcements. The old drop it to the paper, get on morning radio, do the press conference, get beaten up, pray that it makes it to the 6 p.m. news, and in the 6 p.m. news have everybody else slagging you off for whatever it was because they didn't know about it. That still exists to some extent, but nowhere near what it was, and it's far more likely, same as Victoria, but I think in its own Queensland way, you're far more likely to see a Facebook only or a social media only announcement strategy, and to have far more cut through in the community.
It's fascinating you've mentioned that, yeah. And it's what I've noticed, certainly in Victoria, and I guess that it's the same that would be happening in Queensland, the word that you said, unfiltered, it's driving the journalists insane here in Victoria, the fact that the Premier is having a direct conversation every day at around 10:30, and it's the consistency as well. People know when he's standing up, and I guess it's the same for Anastasia up in Queensland. It's a direct conversation with the electorate. It's such a powerful tool.
Yeah, I mean, I called them the other week. It's the modern fireside chat, and I'm sure, I wasn't around when FDR was doing his fireside chats, but I'm sure it drove the newspaper men crazy that he had a means of directly talking to the population without having to go through them to have them scribble it up. And I think we're seeing a very similar phenomenon now.
Sticking with social media, because here's one particular campaign that has invested a lot of money in the federal election on social media advertising, and that's Clive Palmer and the Palmer United Party. Do you just want to, let's spend a bit of time on some of the minor parties. Do you want to unpack his campaign goals and how he's going about it in 2020 with the Queensland state election?
Yeah, and I'm glad we've started with Clive, because I think even those who really watched closely in 2019 still don't really appreciate what it was that he was doing and what the goals were, and we're seeing that playbook sort of on steroids now. So Clive Palmer, and he's a litigious fellow, so we all should be careful. But Clive Palmer and United Australia Party, they're not a political party; they're an interest group, and it's. Particularly I know people on this podcast listen a lot and follow US politics a lot. If you think of Clive like a super PAC, it all makes sense, as opposed to like his goal is not to elect members of parliament. I've just spent 7 days on the road from the Gold Coast to Townsville and dropping into a whole host of seats up the coast. I think I have seen one Palmer person standing on Prepoll, and they weren't even standing; they were sitting. The United Party is not trying to elect people; they're trying to demolish the Labor primary vote. And the difference this time around from 2019 is this time they're saying the lie out loud; they're not saying it quietly. So they are running extensive TV ads, including all through last night's AFL Grand Final. They're running it on billboards and social media, and the message: stop Labor's death tax. It is the exact same, and for sake of clarity, there is no death tax. There wouldn't be no death tax. It is the exact same lie that he ran in the 2019 federal, and this time he's putting on billboards and he's putting on TV ads, now he's doing that, and the reason he is fielding 93 candidates is because of changes that were introduced to the electoral donation system. In order to be able to spend money as a party, you have to field a certain amount of candidates, and your spending cap goes up proportionally. So he has made sure that he has got 93 what Anthony Green called paper candidates, or rather he said they were like paper candidates. Again, he's a litigious bloke. He is fielding 93 candidates to ensure that he has the maximum amount that he can spend statewide, and he is doing that same flooding of the air wars with a lie, and it's only aimed at one party, and it's only aimed with one message, and it's designed to drive down Labor primary vote across the state.
I understand that Queensland Labor State Secretary and Campaign Manager Julianne Campbell had written to either the Electoral Commission or to somebody basically saying, look, can we just, this death tax thing, can we just get a handle on this? They did make some slight changes to the Palmer United Party.
They included the qualifier of it could or might in small text in the newspaper ads. In terms of the font size of the TV ads, it still says stop Labor's death tax.
It's a worry.
Very much so. So, there's your big unknown, is what influence does that air war have? Have people heard it all before? Were there different factors in 2019 given the other changes that Labor was proposing to the taxation system? Did that make us more susceptible to that sort of attack? Will it be effective this time around? What does that mean? They're the big unknowns for Saturday.
Just one other question on the sort of the minor parties on the fringe, the Greens political party and One Nation. What does success look like for those two parties at this upcoming election?
So success for the Greens looks like retaining the seat of Maywa, which they currently hold, which is a bit of a blue-green contest. It looks like gaining South Brisbane off the back of LNP preferences, and potentially moving into McConnell, which is the old seat of Brisbane Central as well, which is traditionally has been a fairly tight three-corner race where everyone kind of finishes on some combination of 30%, and whoever comes in third kind of determines who comes in first, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So the success for them kind of looks like, retaining and growing. For One Nation, it's a bit more tricky. They currently have one seat. They're working very hard to retain it. I've seen a lot of, there's a lot of presence on the ground of One Nation at strategic prepolls that they need to hold that seat that they currently have in Morani. And if they can potentially pick off some other LNP seats, they'd be pretty happy with that. But it's really about retaining that. Interestingly, despite it being our home state, you've not seen a lot of Pauline in this race. I saw her in person at only two seats, and on both those were over the weekend just gone. And the media coverage of that was actually, the tone of it and the storyline of that was Pauline enters the race because she has been so absent and been so absent for so long. There are a range of different theories about why that might be. Again, the electoral funding model has all changed, where you can only sort of get back from public funding what you spend. So the idea of sort of getting a certain percentage of the vote and getting a certain higher number of public funding is no longer there. Now, again, someone else is litigious, so I'm not suggesting that is what they're doing. I'm just stating that fact alongside the other fact. But it's been a very, very low key, and you've seen that reflected in public polling with the One Nation vote sort of collapsing in a lot of places compared to where it was in 2017, which is a bit of a high point for them more recently.
Nice segue there with polling. What's the polling looking like heading into the final week of the campaign?
So all the public polling has been pretty tight and margin of error territory, both from the middle of the year, start of the campaign, and now going into that last week. Really has been bouncing around between 52-48, 41-49 in the favour of the government. Again, that's statewide, and as we spoke about, there's a whole bunch of regional variations within that. The numbers that I really look at that came out right at the start of the campaign: net satisfaction rating of the leaders, the Premier on a net satisfaction rating of +30, the LNP leader on -3%, which tells you a bit about where, who the preferred Premier is, how they think the two leaders are going. And I think also, most interestingly, that poll also showed at the start of the campaign, preferred economic manager, Anastasia Palaszczuk 40%, Deb Frecklinton 27%. Okay. So, which is a very much not what we've come to expect, and says a lot about where people sort of think the recovery is going. So, the challenge for Labor is, I think, that polling would sort of indicate people know who they want the Premier to be. People like what the current Premier is doing. But the question for Labor is, can we convert that into votes in the ballot box?
Do you have any insight into seat level polling that can tell us a bit more about the story in these margins?
Yeah, there were 3 that came out in a news poll just the other day, I think over the weekend, in 3 key seats. One in south of Brisbane, Mansfield, where Labor held a 0.5 advantage over the LNP in a 2-party preferred sense. One in Townsville, Mundingburra, where the LNP held a 0.5% advantage above Labor. So both those contests very, very tight. And also some public polling in Palmerston, which is out to Barabi Island way to the north of Brisbane, where it showed ALP at 54 to an LNP 46. So that one showing a very healthy Labor number. And listeners should know that that seat would be an ALP gain. That's currently an LNP seat where they are, on this public polling at least, trailing. But you can see in other parts, including seats that we hold in Townsville, there are some very, very, very tight races.
We'll go to some of the seats to watch towards the end in a moment. But before we do, just one quick question. On election night, when we're watching, what kind of number do we want to see in terms of Labor's primary vote at a statewide level that we're going to feel comfortable about?
High threes is always a good sign. But I'd be kidding if I'd say I'd thought about a target number to look at, just given how patchy that result will be. I'm always a little bit wary. I think particularly in this election, thinking about it, that given how high the Premier's personal satisfaction rating is and how pleased people are with the result and the work we've done on COVID, it is entirely plausible that we really run up the board on that popular vote, that it might not necessarily translate into seats, in that we might massively increase our supporters in held seats, or even in places where the margin is so large we won't be able to make a difference, by picking up, and you hear this anecdotally all the time, of people who are voting Labor for the first time in their lives because of the economic health response. And then you ask them where they live, and you just realise the margin is sort of insurmountable, or they're already in a Labor area. So as a consequence, you might sort of see some very large statewide Labor numbers. But again, that question is, are they in the right places?
Early voting is entering into its second week, obviously. It started last week. And when I spoke to Jackie Tratt on the podcast last week, she was talking, I think it was Tuesday we might have spoke. So she'd already had 1.5 days of pre-poll and talked about these historic large numbers of people turning out to vote early. What's your read into this? Is this just people just voting because they know they can vote early, and also because of coronavirus, or is there something a bit more going on in terms of the electorate, in terms of a mood and enthusiasm for Labor?
Yeah, that's the big question, and the answer is probably honestly both. So there has been a really, again, COVID, the great accelerator. We know that pre-poll has been shifting bigger and bigger and bigger each election cycle. I think the real difference this time around is both the major parties and, I think crucially, the Electoral Commission have recognised that and are actively driving people to do it. So when you have even the Electoral Commission actively encouraging and pushing people to do a pre-poll or take out a postal, that has really driven the numbers higher. And they're doing that for social distancing and for COVID reasons. And to really spread it out. And you've had the Electoral Commission calling it a election period, not election day and pre-poll. So that messaging, which people like you and me have been saying for a long time, is coming, and we need to readjust how we're thinking, and we need to change the nature of how campaigns are structured. As I sort of outlined before, you could see that Labor well and truly got that, and they front loaded all the big bang stuff. LNP didn't quite get that. If you look at that, but you can see between yeah, exactly. So you can see between the government and the ECQ really encouraging that process. We're now at the point where if you took all the postal votes that have been mailed and all the pre-polls that have been cast, there's about 45% of the vote is either in a ballot box or in a letterbox, and that's with a full week to go. Now, not every postal vote turns into a cast postal vote. Sometimes people get the postal vote and they walk past pre-poll and they drop in there instead, or they decide to hold off or whatever. But it's still a pretty good rule of thumb. There's about 45% of the vote floating out, like I said, either in a box or in the letterbox. Now, does that tell us anything particularly interesting about whether, has everyone who wanted to vote for Labor come out the first week and pre-poll is going to be awful for the next 5 days? I guess I'm going to find out tomorrow and the day after. Or is this really just a really good public health message in a year of really good public health communication messages? I tend to think that it's been a year of having trust in institutions increase, as people say, for health reasons. We'd like you to do these steps in order to mitigate risk, and people largely going and complying with it. I suspect this is just a continuation of that. Now, the one interesting thing I will sort of chip in there, jumping around a little bit, about an unintended consequence of having Prepoll spread out for so long and in such large numbers is it puts, to some extent, it has the ability to put minor or fringe parties at the same resource level as major parties. And so, as we both know, normally, when the majority of the voting is occurring on election day, there is no way that the party can staff 23 booths across an electorate, but they can staff one Prepoll location for 2 weeks. They can take 2 weeks off work and sit there. Now, they won't have the same numbers of people, and they might not have the same message infrastructure, and they definitely won't have any of the other tools that come from being a party of government. But in terms of being there on the booth, they've got the same ability to put their how to vote card in your hand as a major party. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's a side effect of that, as we see an uptick in some minor or fringe parties, which I would put down to really high Prepoll numbers and the ability of them to stand on the street corner the same as anybody else.
Let's turn to the seats to watch on election night. And I'm wondering if, Elliot, I don't know if you're a gambling man, but I know that some of our listeners are, and they'll be intently wondering what seats they should throw some money on. I've actually just opened up Sportsbet here, and just want to get you to run the card through about some of the seats that we should be watching on election night to get a sense about how Labor's going to fare. And I might, I don't know if you've had a chance to know what the odds are, but as you call them out, I might just quickly Google them and find out as well.
I'll preface by going, I've had a quick squeeze at Sportsbet myself. I'm Punters Caucus adjacent, as opposed to participatory, but I've got a good sense of where all the numbers are. Most of them sort of feel about right. But there's one which we'll see how many people listen to this and how many people trust me, because if I get this right and there's a run on Tuesday, then we'll know that people had to listen. So we'll see how we go. Absolutely. So in southeast Queensland and the coast, the big seats to keep an eye on the night: Aspley, Mansfield, Palmerston, Currumbin, South Brisbane, and probably on top of that, I call them the 3 Cs, which could be some big outliers. And these also, I guess, could be potentially there could be some money sitting in these ones. Clayfield, Chatsworth, and Coomera, I'd keep a sneaky eye on as well. I think those last 3 will probably get some pretty good odds, I would have thought. So,
pardon my complete ignorance, I don't even know if they're Labor held or LNP held. Aspley, is that?
It's Labor held.
Yep. I think the odds there are $1.85 for Labor. Is that?
Yeah, that feels about right. It's the most marginal in southeast Queensland. The sitting MP, Bart Mellish, has worked his butt off over the last 3 years, but it's a tight race. He's up against a former Brisbane City councillor of the same area, so it's a tough race.
Mansfield,
Labor held.
$1.50.
Another tight contest. That was a gain from 2017. Picked off from a shadow minister. Palmerston LNP held.
I'm just trying to see what the odds of that. It's $1.50 for Labor, $2.50 for the LNP.
And I suspect that's probably come in after that public polling that showed a pretty big Labor advantage over the weekend. Currumbin, currently LNP held, really tight margin of 1 point something or other.
I'm trying to find the odds. There's not given odds on Currumbin for some reason. Why is that?
But you can start your own market.
Yeah, maybe. No, Sportsbet have no odds on
that.
It's
not there. Currumbin, one to watch. So there was a by-election held in Currumbin in March, right at the start of the pandemic. Labor had a massive swing towards it, just missed out. Currumbin is the southernmost seat. Really interesting dynamics going on there. You've got the former LNP member who retired and caused the by-election. You've got her husband running as an independent, so running under the same name as herself. It's also where you've got Clive Palmer's wife, who features in all their advertising, is running as a candidate in that seat. There's a lot of lot of funky stuff going on in Currumbin.
Our friend Jackie Trad in South Brisbane, the Greens are at $1.50 and Labor's at $2.50. You'd take that, wouldn't you? $2.50 for Labor for Jackie, incumbent.
I'd jump on.
And
I'd volunteer to jump on.
Nice. And Clayfield, Chatsworth, and Coomera. I'm just trying to find your three C's there. Clayfield is
LNP held
$7.50 for Labor.
So this is what I'm saying. These are the three outliers currently held by the most recent former leader of the LNP. But stranger things can happen.
Chatsworth,
LNP held
$4.50 for Labor, $1.20 for the Libs.
Coomera again, LNP held.
And also not on Sportsbet for some reason.
So far out of range, is it? But anyway, they're sort of the SEQ outliers.
And then heading north.
So heading north, Townsville really all three seats. So Townsville, Mundingburra, and Tharangawa, all very marginal, all currently held by Labor, or will be tough holds, and a lot of time has been put into those. In fact, I think the Premier is here today, as is the opposition leader.
And heading north into final
for the north, Cairns. Keep an eye on both Cairns and Barron River again. Both ALP holds, both critical to hold for Labor.
Cairns is $1.70. Just two terrible facts to point out. The three seats that I was given charge of in the 2012 campaign was Cairns, Barron River, and is it Mulgrave, the seat down south?
Yep.
And we held Mulgrave, lost Cairns for the first time I think since the seat was first created, and lost Barron River. And I want to point out, I spent more time in Cairns and Barron River and less time in Mulgrave. So
the Donnelly effect worked again.
It was terrible. And great candidates as well. Steve Whitnall in Barron River, loved him. He was a top bloke. I was devastated for him when he lost. In fact, he was my very first loss ever. I'd never worked on a losing campaign until that one. But great to know that they're both in Labor hands again. Barron River is $2.40 for Labor, $1.55 for the LNP. Yeah. What's going on there?
Tough race. Just a really, really tough race.
When I landed at the airport and got my hire car, and then I drove straight to Barron River from the airport. And as I'm driving along that freeway or that road that kind of has got wetlands either side of it, and if it rains heavily, it can get flooded and you can't get across. As I was heading up there was a property on my left-hand side, and on a huge, huge flagpole, like a huge one, was flying the Confederate flag. And I went, okay, welcome to final Queensland, Stephen. This is going to be a great month and a half.
Well, and I'll get towed up for this because I'll probably get it wrong. But if you were doing that drive today, you'd be driving through the construction of the Smithfield bypass, brought to you by the Labor government.
Yes.
But I probably got that wrong on the way through.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's investing, it's infrastructure, it's jobs. And then just wrapping up the last couple of seats, Elliot, that we need to keep a look on.
So Keppel, north of Rockhampton, another tough race. A lot of One Nation presence down there. Morani, as I said before, that's the current One Nation hold. Can they hold it? Which way does it go? There's also the seat currently held by the former LNP member turned independent turned North Queensland First in Whitsundays. Does that stay in independent hands? Does it go back to the LNP? Does Labor pick it up? Let's watch this space. And the one that I'm going to try and cause a run on, only because I spent a few hours handing out for him and thinks a fantastic candidate, is the seat of Bundaberg. Has been held by Labor over a long time, not currently held by Labor. The margins for something. I think he's an absolutely phenomenal candidate, local school teacher. And you'll now reveal the odds and see how crazy that is.
$2.20 for Labor, $1.65 for the Tories.
Not as bad as some of my other picks.
There you
go.
Still worth it. It's still worth it. Well, that's the inside mail there for everyone. So if you are a betting person, there's some inside information that you can choose to do what you like with it. Plans on election day, Elliot, and gut feeling predictions if you want to make any.
Staying out of the prediction business as best I can. Straight a bit too far in the seats to watch even. Election day, I'll be helping Linus Power and Logan and handing out for him in the morning, and a seat which I've have done a lot of work with over the years, and probably in the afternoon heading up to Aspley and helping my mate Bart Mellish.
Fantastic. Give my love to Linus. Love that man. It's actually amazing. I've actually not had Linus on the podcast. I must correct that. Maybe I'll get him on after the campaign. Best of luck to you. Best of luck to everyone in the caucus and all the Labor volunteers and supporters on not just election day, but this week. Prepoll is just as important as it is now on election day, as you've just pointed out. And also, Elliot, thank you very much for taking time out of your birthday to come on the show, no less, and talk to us and give us a preview of a really, really important election in the grand scheme of things here in Australia. Big state, Labor government got to hang on to these things in a COVID election, as you said, and hopefully the Palaszczuk government are returned on Saturday night.
It can be my delayed birthday present. Really appreciate the time.